On June 29, 1978, Hollywood star Bob Crane was found brutally murdered in his Scottsdale apartment. 47 years later, the question remains, who killed Bob Crane? And why does this chilling case still haunt us today? Bob Crane was once the man America laughed with every week, a handsome, quick-witted TV star whose charm seemed effortless. To millions, he was Colonel Hogan from Hogan's Heroes, the clever and confident prisoner of war who always outsmarted his captors with humor and heart. But away from the studio lights, Bob Crane was far more complicated than the man audiences adored. His story wasn't just about fame, it was about the loneliness that often hides behind it, the double life of a man who could make everyone smile but could never find peace within himself. Born in 1928 in Waterbury, Connecticut, Crane grew up with a fascination for sound, rhythm, and performance. By the 1950s, he had carved out a career as one of the most popular radio hosts in Los Angeles. His morning show on KNX radio turned him into a local celebrity, known for his sharp humor, quick banter, and magnetic voice. He interviewed stars like Marilyn Monroe and Bob Hope with an ease that made him one of the industry's best conversationalists. That charisma caught the attention of television producers, and by 1965, Crane landed the role that would define his career, Colonel Robert E. Hogan. The show Hogan's Heroes was an instant hit, and for 6 seasons, Crane became the face of clever resistance, the symbol of light-hearted courage in dark times. But as his fame grew, so did the gap between the man America thought they knew and the one he was becoming. The fame, the adoration, the attention, all of it came at a price. Crane wasn't just basking in success, he was losing himself to it. When the cameras stopped rolling, Bob Crane's life took on a different tone, one marked by restlessness and secrecy. He was no longer just the charming actor who played Hogan. He was a man searching for something deeper, something he couldn't find in the applause of a studio audience. Those who knew him best said he struggled with the same loneliness that often haunts entertainers who live in the spotlight. For Crane, that loneliness found its outlet in obsession. It began innocently enough, an interest in photography and video technology. But over time, it became something else entirely. He started recording his intimate relationships, creating a private archive of encounters that few people knew about. What began as curiosity turned into a ritual. The camera became his constant companion, a tool through which he documented, controlled, and relived his experiences. In those tapes, Crane wasn't the TV hero or the family man. He was something else, someone craving validation, power, and attention in ways that no audience could provide. As his obsession grew, his personal relationships began to fracture. His first marriage to Terzian, the mother of his 3 children, fell apart under the strain of infidelity and emotional distance. Friends later recalled that and had reached her breaking point, unable to compete with the growing void in their marriage. The spotlight had consumed too much of Crane's energy, leaving little for the people who truly needed him. When Crane remarried in 1970, it seemed like a new beginning. His second wife, Sigrid Valdis, who played Hilda on Hogan's Heroes, shared his television world. They looked like the perfect couple, smiling for cameras, embodying the Hollywood dream. But beneath the surface, the same old patterns repeated. Crane's private life was spiraling into secrecy and addiction to the thrill of filming his encounters. He wasn't just documenting, he was living through the lens. What he couldn't control in life, he tried to control on tape. His new marriage began to crumble under the weight of his double life. Those close to the couple described the growing tension between them. Crane's constant travels, his late nights, his increasingly detached behavior. Sigrid reportedly became aware of his obsession, and the emotional distance widened. The very tools that made him famous, his charm and charisma, had become weapons of self-destruction in his personal world. For Crane's children, especially his son Robert, the image of their father was complicated. To the world, he was the confident, beloved TV star. To them, he was a man slipping further away from his family, consumed by his own impulses. Robert would later recall how the distance between them wasn't just physical, it was emotional. The laughter that had once filled their home had been replaced by silence and confusion. Fame had given their father everything, yet taken away the very parts of him that made him human. Bob Crane's decline was not sudden, it was gradual, almost invisible to those outside his circle. As Hogan's Heroes ended in 1971, the fame that had once seemed limitless began to fade. He took smaller acting roles, appeared in dinner theater productions, and tried to hold on to the remnants of his celebrity. But Hollywood moves quickly, and Crane found himself struggling to adapt. The applause that once defined him grew quieter. The man who had once been adored by millions now found validation through his hidden tapes. He confided in friends that he wanted to make changes, to move away from the lifestyle that was consuming him. But breaking free proved harder than he imagined. His recordings had become a symbol of control, a way to command the narrative when everything else in his life felt unstable. As his career dimmed, the walls between his public image and private world began to collapse. Even in his later years, Crane's charisma never completely vanished. He could still light up a room with his humor and charm, but those who looked closer could see the cracks. Behind the quick smile was a man burdened by regret, loneliness, and fear. His private habits were no longer just a secret, they were a shadow that followed him everywhere. In the months before his death, Crane was reportedly trying to turn his life around. He had spoken about distancing himself from certain friends, re-evaluating his career, and seeking more stability. His closest confidant said he seemed tired of the double life. He wanted to focus on rebuilding his relationships, especially with his children. But those intentions came too late. The patterns of secrecy and obsession had already set events in motion that would change everything. His final years were a paradox, an actor trying to revive his career while silently battling the fallout of his own choices. He performed in theater productions across the country, still drawing crowds who remembered him as Colonel Hogan. But fame couldn't fix what had been broken. His relationships were strained, his second marriage was falling apart, and his sense of direction was fading. He had built a world on charm and control, but by 1978, both had started slipping from his grasp. The tragedy of Bob Crane's life wasn't just his death, it was how far he had drifted from the man the world thought he was. To the public, he remained a beloved icon of 1960s television. But to those who truly knew him, he was a man trapped between two worlds, one filled with laughter and light, the other consumed by secrecy and self-destruction. His story serves as a haunting reflection of the fragile line between fame and isolation, between admiration and addiction. As his son Robert would later say, his father's life was not defined by his final moments, but by the struggle to reconcile the man on screen with the one who existed off it. The camera, once his instrument of art and control, became both his comfort and his curse. In the end, Bob Crane's need to document everything left behind more questions than answers, a trail of tapes, secrets, and fractured memories. The life of Bob Crane remains one of Hollywood's most complex and tragic stories. His brilliance, humor, and talent made him a star, but the loneliness behind that smile tells a story that fame alone could never hide. His journey from beloved comedian to a man haunted by his own desires sets the stage for the mystery that would follow, the unsolved crime that still echoes through Hollywood decades later. Where are you watching from? Drop your locations in the comments below. If you made it to this point, drop your comment with "I am still here." Let's see who is still watching. John Henry Carpenter was not just another acquaintance in Bob Crane's life. He was a confidant, someone who shared more than just casual moments with the TV star. Carpenter, a video equipment salesman by profession, had a deep involvement in the private world that Crane tried desperately to keep hidden from the public. On the surface, Carpenter appeared to be nothing more than a quiet, unassuming man, a friend who, like many others, worked behind the scenes of Hollywood. But beneath that exterior, he was a man with a complicated psychology, a man driven by insecurities and deep emotional needs that would soon clash violently with his long-standing bond with Crane. Carpenter's relationship with Crane was far from ordinary. They shared more than just a friendship, they shared a secret world. They were bound by mutual interests that only a few knew of. The two men bonded over their fascination with technology, particularly video equipment, and the shared desire to document their lives in ways most people would never consider. Crane's obsession with videotaping intimate encounters was a key part of their bond. But unlike the average friend, Carpenter was actively involved in this secret world, helping set up equipment, and in some cases, even being part of the recordings. This friendship, built on shared experiences and trust, was perhaps one of the most intense relationships in both men's lives. But as with all close relationships, especially those that rely on secrecy, cracks began to appear. Carpenter's role in Crane's life was complicated. He was both a participant in the escapism Crane sought and an observer of the tension and emotional distance that began to grow. Carpenter, whose insecurities were often masked by his quiet demeanor, was far more invested in the relationship than most people realized. When that bond started to fray, it would ignite a chain of events that would forever alter both their lives. John Henry Carpenter was not just a video equipment salesman. He was a confidant, a man who shared Crane's private world. But like all close relationships, secrets festered beneath the surface. And when their friendship began to unravel, so did Carpenter's sanity. Over the years, the bond between Crane and Carpenter had evolved into something far more complex than either of them likely anticipated. Carpenter, despite being the quieter of the two, had an emotional attachment to Crane that went beyond friendship. It was an attachment rooted in deep insecurities, perhaps even a dependence on the connection they shared. This emotional bond was tested when Crane began to contemplate cutting ties with Carpenter, a decision that would serve as the breaking point for their relationship. In the months leading up to his death, Crane had expressed to a few friends and family members that he wanted to distance himself from Carpenter. This was more than a desire for space, it was a decision to sever ties with a man who had been involved in his life for years, someone with whom he had shared intimate moments and confided in. For Carpenter, this was not just a change of direction, it was a rejection. It was, in his eyes, an abandonment of the trust they had built together. Crane's desire to move forward without Carpenter was an emotional betrayal, and that rejection triggered something darker within Carpenter. The unraveling of their friendship didn't occur suddenly. It had been building over time. Carpenter's growing frustrations were fueled by the sense that Crane was pulling away from him, not just physically, but emotionally. Carpenter's world, for years, had revolved around his connection to Crane. To lose that was to lose a significant part of his identity. It was more than just the end of a friendship, it was the destruction of a shared life. The emotional toll on Carpenter was profound, and his reaction to this perceived betrayal was intense. A man who had once been a trusted confidant now found himself on the outside, looking in. The sense of rejection and betrayal weighed heavily on him, and as the pressure built, so did the tension. Crane's desire to cut ties with Carpenter wasn't just a mere decision. It was a betrayal. Carpenter saw it as a rejection. A man pushed to his breaking point. But did the bonds of friendship snap, or were they severed by something far darker? As their friendship deteriorated, the question of motive began to emerge. What drove John Henry Carpenter to become a prime suspect in Bob Crane's murder? Carpenter's actions were fueled by a mix of jealousy, emotional instability, and resentment. His relationship with Crane had always been one of deep dependency, but when Crane began to pull away, it exposed the raw insecurities that had been simmering beneath the surface for years. The betrayal Carpenter felt from Crane's decision to end their friendship became the catalyst for something much more dangerous. At the heart of Carpenter's emotional turmoil was the belief that without Crane, his life would lose its meaning. Crane had been his anchor, and without him, Carpenter's sense of self began to crumble. This sense of loss manifested in anger and frustration, emotions that Carpenter could no longer control. He was a man who had invested too much emotionally in the friendship, and when that bond was severed, he may have seen murder as the only way to bring Crane back into his life, if not physically, then at least in a way that kept him close forever. The complexity of Carpenter's emotions was reflected in his actions after the murder. Despite being a prime suspect, Carpenter maintained his innocence, insisting that he had no involvement in Crane's death. But his own behavior, his evasiveness, his failure to fully explain his whereabouts on the night of the murder, added fuel to the growing suspicion. Did Carpenter truly kill Crane out of jealousy? Or was there something deeper, something buried beneath years of shared secrets and strained emotions? The emotional attachment Carpenter had to Crane, coupled with the deep sense of betrayal he felt, created a volatile mix of emotions that ultimately led to a tragic outcome. A man whose entire world revolved around another. Betrayed. Rejected. Could Carpenter have been driven to murder as a way to keep Crane close, forever? The relationship between John Henry Carpenter and Bob Crane was one defined by contradictions, friendship and dependence, trust and betrayal. Carpenter's obsession with Crane was not merely about admiration or respect, it was a deep emotional attachment that bordered on unhealthy. Carpenter had relied on Crane not just as a friend but as a validation of his own existence. The emotional and psychological dependence Carpenter had on Crane made it impossible for him to let go. When Crane made the decision to sever ties, Carpenter's reaction was not one of understanding but of a man who felt completely undone. This was not simply the loss of a friendship, this was the loss of a part of himself. The idea of Crane moving on without him, of choosing a different path, was something Carpenter couldn't accept. His jealousy, compounded by the loss of control he felt over his own life, led him down a dark path. Carpenter was a man who had always been in the background, quietly assisting Crane in his secret life. But when Crane decided to leave that life behind, Carpenter felt that his own world was collapsing. What makes Carpenter's actions even more complex is the psychological toll of living in the shadows of someone like Bob Crane. Carpenter's role in Crane's life was never fully understood by outsiders. He was both a participant in and a spectator of Crane's darker, hidden desires. This duality, being both inside and outside Crane's world, created a unique dynamic between the two men, one that, when it began to unravel, became a powder keg of emotional chaos. As the investigation into Crane's death unfolded, Carpenter's motivations remained unclear, but the emotional tension between the two men painted a disturbing picture. Was it jealousy that led to murder? Or was it something deeper, a reflection of Carpenter's emotional breakdown when faced with rejection from the one person he trusted the most? John Henry Carpenter's story is one of deep emotional conflict and psychological fragility. His relationship with Bob Crane was far from simple, it was a bond built on secrecy, dependency, and unspoken resentments. When Crane decided to cut ties with Carpenter, it set off a chain of events that ultimately led to one of Hollywood's most mysterious and tragic murders. Carpenter's obsession with Crane, coupled with feelings of betrayal and rejection, created a volatile mix of emotions that no one, not even Crane, could foresee. The morning of June 29, 1978, arrived quietly in Scottsdale, Arizona, a stark contrast to the chaos that would soon unfold. When the police entered the second-floor apartment at 77th Street, the scene that greeted them was unsettling in its stillness. Everything appeared to be in order, yet something was horribly wrong. There was no sign of forced entry, no signs of a break-in. No one had ransacked the apartment, the door had simply been left ajar. In the middle of the neat, lived-in space, Bob Crane's lifeless body lay in his bedroom, a gruesome sight that would become a lasting memory for those who discovered him. The sight of Crane's body was an unnerving contrast to the man millions knew as Colonel Robert E. Hogan from Hogan's Heroes. The body, cruelly bludgeoned, appeared almost untouched by the chaos that should have accompanied such a violent act. The absence of a struggle only deepened the mystery, there were no signs of a fight, no overturned furniture, no sign that Crane had even attempted to defend himself. It was as if the world he inhabited was suddenly torn apart in a way no one could have predicted. This wasn't an act of chance, this was something far more calculated and personal. The lack of forced entry suggested a brutal, intimate knowledge of Crane's life, the killer was someone who had been invited in. It wasn't a stranger's rage but the kind of violence born out of a deeper connection. The police quickly understood that this wasn't just a random crime, it was a deliberate act, executed with precision. The victim wasn't just a celebrity, he was someone who had opened the door to the wrong person. And in that act of trust, the killer had found a way to strike, a way to silence him forever. The scene was both serene and horrifying, a jarring juxtaposition that left the investigators with more questions than answers. On that fateful morning, detectives arrived to an apartment that seemed frozen in time. No forced entry. No sign of a struggle. Just the body of Bob Crane, a star taken from the world too soon. A brutal act, committed by someone who knew him well. The investigation into Bob Crane's death unfolded slowly, a puzzle with pieces that didn't fit. As the detectives worked through the crime scene, they found themselves stymied at every turn. No fingerprints, no DNA, no physical evidence that could directly link anyone to the crime. The apartment had been meticulously cleaned, almost as though the killer had planned every detail of the crime to leave behind no trace. Without any immediate leads, the detectives were left with only the victim's life and relationships to guide them. In the absence of forensic evidence, the investigators began looking into Bob Crane's personal life. It quickly became clear that there were layers to this case that went beyond Crane's public persona. Crane's relationships, his marriages, his friendships, and his known obsession with filming his sexual encounters, became the focal point of the investigation. His personal life had been more complicated than anyone had assumed, and those complexities made the case even more difficult to solve. The detectives, still grappling with the lack of physical evidence, turned to Crane's close circle of friends and family. They interviewed those who had worked with him on Hogan's Heroes, those who had known him both on and off the screen. But no one seemed to have a clear motive for why anyone would want to hurt him. He wasn't involved in any significant controversies. He didn't have enemies that anyone could point to. His public life was far from perfect, but it wasn't the kind of life that should have led to murder. In the days following Crane's death, a team of detectives scrambled to find a lead. No fingerprints, no witnesses, just a blood-stained room and a life snuffed out in the prime of its success. The lack of evidence left the investigators grasping for anything they could use to unravel the mystery. Every lead seemed to go cold, and the investigation soon became a frustrating and fruitless chase. With no apparent motive and no solid suspects, the case began to weigh heavily on the detectives. There was a profound sense of unease, a realization that the person responsible was someone who had been close to Crane, but that person remained elusive. With every passing day, the investigation seemed more like a maze with no exit. As the investigation dragged on, one name kept resurfacing: John Henry Carpenter. Carpenter was no stranger to the investigation. He had been one of Crane's closest friends, a confidant who shared in Crane's more private life. He had been involved in Crane's obsession with videotaping his sexual encounters and had spent a great deal of time in the star's inner circle. He knew Crane intimately, perhaps more intimately than anyone else, including his family. Carpenter's name emerged in the investigation when it became clear that Crane had planned to cut ties with him. Friends of Crane, including his son Robert, revealed that Bob had been growing distant from Carpenter in the months leading up to his death. He had confided in them that he wanted to sever ties with the man who had been a significant part of his life for so long. For Carpenter, this decision was nothing short of a betrayal. The bond they had shared, one that was rooted in secrecy and shared desires, was coming to an end. And for a man who had invested so much emotionally in the friendship, this rejection was devastating. As the investigation into Crane's death intensified, the connection between Carpenter and the crime became impossible to ignore. Carpenter was one of the last people to see Crane alive, and his alibi for the night of the murder was shaky at best. He claimed to have been at a woman's house during the time of the murder, but there was no concrete evidence to verify his whereabouts. As the detectives dug deeper into Carpenter's life, they began to notice inconsistencies in his story. Carpenter's behavior became increasingly erratic, and his refusal to cooperate fully with the investigation raised suspicions. Could he have been involved in Crane's death? Despite the growing evidence of his possible involvement, Carpenter maintained his innocence. He insisted that he had no reason to harm Crane and that he had no part in the murder. His alibi, although unproven, seemed to be his only defense. And yet, His connection to Crane, his emotional dependence on the star, began to make him a prime suspect. If Crane had truly been planning to end their relationship, could that have been the breaking point for Carpenter? Was the rejection so intense that it drove him to violence? Then, the name John Henry Carpenter surfaced. A friend. A confidant. But could he also be the killer? The pieces didn't fit, but neither did the alternatives. The detectives were left with an agonizing question: was Carpenter guilty, or was there something more to the story? His emotional attachment to Crane, the tension in their friendship, and the inconsistencies in his alibi all pointed to the possibility that he had played a role in Crane's death. But the lack of direct evidence made it impossible to make a definitive case. For the detectives, the only thing they could be certain of was that the killer had to be someone who knew Crane well, someone who had access to his life. And as the investigation continued, Carpenter remained the prime suspect, his relationship with the victim hanging like a shadow over the case. The discovery of Bob Crane's body marked the beginning of a complex and frustrating investigation. The crime scene, with its lack of forced entry and signs of struggle, suggested that the killer knew the victim intimately, making the case all the more unsettling. The investigation was marked by dead ends and frustration, as the detectives were unable to find any concrete evidence to link a suspect to the crime. As the investigation unfolded, John Henry Carpenter's name emerged as the prime suspect. His deep emotional connection to Crane, his role in Crane's secret life, and his shaky alibi made him a person of interest. Yet, despite mounting suspicions, the evidence against Carpenter was slim, and the detectives found themselves trapped in a case with more questions than answers. Was Carpenter the killer, or was the real culprit still out there? As the case dragged on, the truth seemed just out of reach, and the mystery surrounding Bob Crane's death continued to haunt those who had once known him. The courtroom was filled with anticipation as John Henry Carpenter stood trial for the murder of Bob Crane. It was 1994, and after years of speculation, the moment had finally arrived. The man who had once been a close confidant, a friend, was now accused of ending the life of the beloved TV star. The weight of the case pressed down on Carpenter, and his every move was scrutinized. The proceedings were more than just a legal battle, they were an emotional reckoning, not just for Carpenter but for everyone involved. The public watched with rapt attention, waiting to see whether justice would be served. Carpenter's trial was surrounded by layers of complexity. The prosecution's case rested primarily on circumstantial evidence, the emotional bond between Crane and Carpenter, Carpenter's changing behavior in the months before the murder, and his shaky alibi. However, the prosecution's argument lacked a smoking gun. There were no eyewitnesses, and the forensic evidence was minimal. The bloodstains found in Carpenter's rental car were crucial, but even they could not definitively link him to the crime. The prosecution's theory was persuasive: Crane had rejected Carpenter, and this emotional betrayal could have driven Carpenter to murder. Yet, the absence of concrete evidence made it difficult to prove beyond a reasonable doubt. As the defense team presented their case, they attacked the prosecution's theory, pointing out the lack of hard evidence. Carpenter's defense attorneys argued that the circumstantial evidence was speculative at best. His alibi, though not airtight, was the only evidence standing between him and a conviction. The defense painted Carpenter as a man who had been unfairly dragged into the spotlight, a man wrongly accused based on emotional assumptions rather than facts. The defense team skillfully questioned the reliability of the forensic tests, which at the time were not as advanced as today's DNA testing. 1994, a courtroom. The weight of the world pressed down on John Henry Carpenter as he stood trial for Bob Crane's murder. The evidence was circumstantial, but the pressure was mounting. Was this the man who took Crane's life? Or was justice once again slipping through the cracks? The atmosphere in the courtroom was thick with tension, and every moment was loaded with emotion. The prosecution and defense teams sparred back and forth, each trying to convince the jury of their version of the truth. The stakes were high, not just for Carpenter, but for the family of Bob Crane, who watched from the sidelines, hoping for justice. The tension in the courtroom mirrored the emotional undercurrent of the entire case. Crane's death was not just a tragedy, it was a story of betrayal, of broken trust, and of lives that had been irrevocably changed. The trial reached its climax when the jury, after days of deliberation, delivered a shocking verdict. John Henry Carpenter was acquitted. The courtroom, already tense, became a sea of murmurs as the judge read the decision aloud. Carpenter, standing stoically, was formally released from all charges. The weight of the trial, the accusations, and the emotional toll it had taken on everyone, seemed to dissipate in that moment. But for many, the acquittal felt like an injustice. Carpenter's acquittal was a surprising turn, given the mounting circumstantial evidence. The lack of hard proof had been the prosecution's greatest challenge. Despite the emotional arguments, the absence of definitive forensic evidence meant that Carpenter could not be convicted. The blood found in his rental car could not conclusively be tied to Crane. The technology at the time simply wasn't capable of making such a definitive connection. The absence of fingerprints, the lack of physical evidence from the crime scene, and the uncertainty surrounding Carpenter's alibi all played a part in the jury's decision. Carpenter's defense had successfully cast doubt on the prosecution's case, and without solid proof, the jury had no choice but to acquit. But while the legal process had been completed, the emotional scars remained. For Bob Crane's family, the acquittal was a bitter pill to swallow. They had invested so much hope in seeing justice served, only to be left with more unanswered questions. Was the man they believed to be responsible for the death of their loved one truly innocent, or had the justice system failed them? The acquittal was a victory for Carpenter, but it felt like a loss for everyone who had hoped for closure. In a stunning turn, Carpenter was acquitted. A lack of evidence, the failure to link him conclusively to the crime. The man many believed was guilty was set free. Was this a miscarriage of justice, or simply a case that was too cold to solve? The shockwave of the acquittal extended beyond the courtroom. Carpenter's legal victory did not free him from the emotional and psychological burden of being publicly associated with Crane's murder. The public, while respecting the legal outcome, still questioned his involvement. The lingering doubts about his guilt remained, and Carpenter, despite being acquitted, would never be fully rid of the suspicion surrounding his name. For many, the case wasn't over, it was only just beginning. The aftermath of the trial left a trail of unresolved emotions. For Bob Crane's family, the acquittal was a devastating blow. They had hoped that the trial would bring closure, that they would finally know the truth about who killed Bob. Instead, they were left with the uncomfortable reality that the case had not been solved. The legal system had failed to deliver justice in a case that, to them, seemed clear-cut. For Crane's son Robert, the acquittal only deepened the wound. The loss of his father was painful enough, but the fact that the man they all believed to be the murderer had walked free was a wound that would never heal. John Henry Carpenter, though acquitted, was left to grapple with the emotional fallout of the trial. He was no longer just a friend of Bob Crane, he was a man whose name would forever be associated with a crime he had been accused of committing. The acquittal did not restore his reputation, it simply left him in a limbo of suspicion. Despite being legally innocent, Carpenter knew that many would never believe it. The weight of public opinion was something he could never escape. His emotional breakdown in the years following the trial was evident. He had gone from being a confidant to a man who had been tried and publicly condemned. While the law had exonerated him, the emotional and psychological toll of being suspected of murder stayed with him until his death in 1998. For Carpenter, the acquittal was a mixed blessing. On one hand, it was a legal victory, a validation of his innocence in the eyes of the law. On the other hand, it left him with the unresolved weight of suspicion. He had been a man deeply attached to Bob Crane, and the breakdown of their friendship had been painful. The rejection Crane had expressed by distancing himself from Carpenter was something that Carpenter had taken personally, and the trauma of their fractured relationship lingered long after the trial had ended. His life, which had once been defined by his bond with Crane, was now marked by the shadows of doubt that hung over him. For Crane's family, the acquittal left a bitter taste. Carpenter walked free, but the shadow of guilt never left him. Was he innocent? Or had the truth been buried too deep? For Bob Crane's family, the emotional impact was profound. The public's perception of their father had always been divided, but now, in the wake of the trial, it seemed that they were losing not just the man they loved but the very truth of his death. The trial had not only failed to deliver justice, it had also torn open old wounds. They had to live with the uncertainty that would never be resolved. The question of whether Carpenter was guilty lingered long after the trial, and for the Cranes, the legal system's failure to provide closure only deepened their grief. The trial of John Henry Carpenter, and its shocking acquittal, remains one of the most controversial and tragic chapters in Hollywood's history. The lack of concrete evidence, the emotional turmoil of those involved, and the unanswered questions surrounding Bob Crane's murder left the case unresolved. While Carpenter walked free, the shadow of guilt never fully lifted from him, and the legacy of Bob Crane's untimely death remained shrouded in mystery. For the Crane family, the acquittal was a crushing blow. They had hoped for justice, but instead, they were left with a legacy of unresolved pain and questions that would never be answered. The trial may have ended, but the emotional aftermath of the case continues to resonate. The acquittal did not bring peace to the Crane family or Carpenter, and the truth about what happened to Bob Crane on that fateful night in 1978 remains lost, like a shadowy figure slipping through the cracks of a broken system. If you are enjoying this content, like, subscribe and share to your loved ones to protect them from the same tragic happening to them in the future. In 2016, a twist of fate and modern science gave Bob Crane's cold case a glimmer of new life. Nearly 4 decades after his brutal murder, a breakthrough came from an unexpected place, a reporter named John Hook. Hook, determined to uncover the truth, revisited a crucial piece of evidence that had previously been dismissed as inconclusive, the blood sample found in John Henry Carpenter's rental car. For years, this blood had remained a mystery, its significance lost in the haze of time and outdated technology. But with the strides made in DNA testing, Hook believed there was still a chance to find the answers that had eluded investigators for so long. This new wave of hope was not just a technical advancement, it was a moral and emotional one for those still grieving Crane's death. The idea that modern science could finally offer a definitive answer felt like a lifeline. For Bob Crane's family, and for the countless people who had followed the case over the years, this was more than just another forensic test, it was a final opportunity to find closure. The evidence that had been deemed too degraded to analyze in the past was now being retested with state-of-the-art methods. Could this be the break everyone had been waiting for? Would this be the moment the case finally saw a resolution, or would it end in disappointment once more? In 2016, new technology gave the case a second life. A reporter, John Hook, took the blood samples once thought to be useless and had them retested. But the results were inconclusive. The retesting of the blood samples ignited a new round of excitement and suspense. Everyone involved, from the investigators to the Crane family, clung to the hope that the answers they'd been desperately seeking for so long would finally be within reach. Yet, they knew the path forward was fraught with uncertainty. The results would either reveal a breakthrough or bring about the crushing realization that the mystery would remain unsolved. The case was far from over, and every piece of new evidence was another twist in the long, painful pursuit of justice. The results of the DNA testing arrived, but they weren't the definitive answer everyone had hoped for. Instead of confirming a direct link between John Henry Carpenter and Bob Crane's murder, the test revealed a new layer to the mystery. The blood found in Carpenter's rental car didn't belong to him, and it didn't conclusively match Crane's. Instead, it contained the DNA of an unidentified male, a new lead, but one that led to even more questions. The revelation of another male's DNA in the car was both shocking and frustrating. Was this the break that investigators needed, or just another dead end? The DNA could have belonged to someone completely unrelated to the crime, or it could be the key to solving the case if the identity of the person could be determined. The potential for a new lead was there, but the evidence was too limited to draw any conclusions. The DNA sample was small and degraded by the years, making it impossible to get a clear match. As investigators worked to understand the implications of this finding, the emotional toll of the inconclusive results was felt deeply. For the Crane family, the discovery was another reminder of how much had been lost, another year of uncertainty and another failed attempt to find closure. The frustration was palpable, as the possibility of a breakthrough was dashed by the limitations of modern forensic science. The question now was whether this unidentified male was simply a red herring or a key to unlocking the truth of Bob Crane's murder. The test revealed DNA from an unknown male, another layer to the mystery. Was this the break they needed? Or just another dead end? The tension in the case was further compounded by the realization that modern technology, while a powerful tool, could only do so much. The tiny sample of blood, which had once been dismissed as inconclusive, was now the focus of renewed attention. But despite the cutting-edge technology available, the small size of the sample meant that no conclusive answers could be drawn. For Crane's family, this meant another year of waiting, another year of living with the gnawing uncertainty of never truly knowing who was responsible for his death. As the investigation pressed forward with the new DNA findings, it became painfully clear that while advances in forensic technology could reopen old wounds, they could not always provide the closure everyone desired. Despite the best efforts of investigators, the case of Bob Crane's murder remained an enigma, one that seemed just out of reach. The introduction of this new DNA evidence raised fresh questions, but it also highlighted the gap between the hope for answers and the reality of the case. The mystery surrounding Bob Crane's murder continued to haunt those who sought justice. New technology had allowed the retesting of evidence that had long been deemed useless, yet the results provided no clear answers. The unidentified male's DNA did not bring them closer to identifying the killer, but it did reopen the wound of uncertainty that had plagued the investigation since its inception. It was a cruel irony that despite all the advancements of modern science, the case was still as unresolved as it had been in 1978. The frustration among the investigators was evident. They had invested years of their careers into solving this case, only to be thwarted time and again by the limitations of the evidence. The hope that the DNA test could finally provide a definitive answer was a fleeting dream, now replaced by the harsh reality that modern science could not always uncover the truth. For the Crane family, the pain of not knowing who was responsible for Bob's murder was compounded by the constant cycle of false hope. Each new lead, each new test, seemed to promise closure, only to fall short of delivering it. With new technology comes new questions. The case remains open, but with each passing year, hope for closure fades. Will we ever know the truth? The passage of time worked against the investigation. With each year that passed, the chances of solving the case seemed to diminish. The passage of decades had left the case cold, and each new test revealed how far the truth was buried. But despite this, the hope for justice persisted. The Crane family, the detectives, and the public all clung to the possibility that somewhere, in the vast sea of unanswered questions, the truth was waiting to be uncovered. The case remains open, a reminder of the limitations of time and technology. As the years continue to pass, the likelihood of finding a clear answer seems more remote, but the case is never truly closed. With each new development, the possibility of solving the murder of Bob Crane remains just beyond reach, a tantalizing mystery that continues to haunt everyone involved. The 2016 DNA breakthrough brought new hope, but it also underscored the deep complexities of the case that have plagued investigators for decades. The discovery of the unidentified male's DNA was an intriguing lead, but it did little to bring the case closer to resolution. The limitations of the forensic technology available at the time, combined with the deterioration of the evidence, left the case in an uncertain limbo. For the Crane family, the cycle of hope and disappointment continued, as they waited for answers that may never come. The investigation into Bob Crane's death remains one of Hollywood's most haunting unsolved mysteries. Despite all the advancements in forensic science, the truth remains elusive. The case is a tragic reminder of how some questions, no matter how hard we try to answer them, remain unanswered, buried beneath the weight of time. As new technology emerges, the possibility of solving the case remains, but the years of uncertainty and the emotional toll on those involved continue to cast a long shadow over this iconic tragedy. The case remains open, the answers still out of reach. As new advancements bring us closer to the truth, we must ask, will we ever know who killed Bob Crane? Or will his death remain one of Hollywood's greatest mysteries? As the years passed and the case grew colder, the mystery surrounding Bob Crane's murder only deepened. The unanswered questions, coupled with the lack of definitive evidence, gave rise to a multitude of theories, each one more speculative than the last. Could a jealous lover have been behind the brutal killing? Was an actor with a long-standing grudge against Crane seeking revenge? Or perhaps it was the one person who stood to gain everything from his death, his second wife, Sigrid Valdis. These theories, though grounded in varying degrees of speculation, offered new angles on the case, but none of them could definitively explain the violent end to Crane's life. The theory that most immediately drew attention was the idea that a jealous lover might have been responsible for the murder. Bob Crane was known to have lived a secret, promiscuous life, one that few knew about but many speculated upon. His penchant for filming his sexual encounters with various women had long been a source of gossip. The theory suggested that one of these women, perhaps a scorned lover, had discovered his infidelities and taken matters into her own hands. The intimate nature of the murder, the fact that no struggle was detected, seemed to fit the profile of a crime of passion. Could the man many considered America's sweetheart have been killed by someone whose love for him turned into something much darker? But that theory, while compelling, was soon overshadowed by the idea of an actor seeking revenge. Crane had not only been a popular television star but also a well-connected figure in Hollywood. The theory, proposed by some of the early investigators, pointed to a Texas actor who had had a violent confrontation with Crane several months before his death. The details of the argument remained murky, but some witnesses described it as an explosive, angry exchange. The defense team, years later, would latch onto this theory and argue that this actor could have been the one responsible for the murder, casting doubt on John Henry Carpenter's involvement. If this actor harbored a grudge against Crane, could that anger have led to a fatal confrontation? The theory suggested a much colder, calculated motive behind the murder, one rooted in professional jealousy or personal animosity. And then, there was the theory that hit the hardest, the possibility that Bob Crane's wife, Sigrid Valdis, had played a role in his death. At the time of his murder, Crane had made the decision to leave his estate to Valdis, excluding his children. This revelation sparked rumors and raised eyebrows within their circle. Crane's relationship with Valdis was known to be strained, and there were whispers that she was unhappy with his lifestyle. The theory suggested that she may have felt trapped in a marriage that had lost its spark, and perhaps she saw Crane's death as a way to gain financial independence. Though there was no concrete evidence to link Valdis to the crime, the suspicion lingered in the minds of some who were close to the case. Could it have been a jealous lover? An actor with a grudge? Or perhaps the one person who stood to gain everything from Crane's death, his wife? Each of these theories carried weight, but none of them offered a definitive solution. The case, once filled with promise, now seemed like an inescapable web of conflicting possibilities. With no clear answers, the question remained, who was truly responsible for the death of Bob Crane? Theories surrounding the murder of Bob Crane didn't just complicate the investigation, they deepened the sense of frustration that permeated the case. As new potential suspects emerged, it became increasingly difficult to pinpoint who was truly responsible. Was it Carpenter, driven by emotional rejection and obsession? Was it the Texas actor, carrying the weight of unresolved anger? Or could it have been someone much closer to Crane, someone who stood to gain everything from his death, like Sigrid Valdis? Each theory offered a different perspective on the crime, but none of them could definitively close the case. The use of DNA testing and other forensic methods had failed to provide any clarity, and as time passed, the case grew colder. Each theory seemed to come with its own set of unanswered questions. New possibilities continued to emerge, but they only served to further muddy the waters. The hope for closure, which had briefly flickered after the 2016 DNA testing, quickly faded as the mystery of Bob Crane's death remained unsolved. With every passing year, the likelihood of solving the case seemed to diminish. The theories that once seemed plausible became speculative, and the truth continued to elude everyone involved. What happened that night in 1978 remained a haunting question. Was it a crime of passion? A cold act of revenge? Or something else entirely? The unresolved nature of the case left those involved with it frustrated and disillusioned. With new technology comes new questions. The case remains open, but with each passing year, hope for closure fades. Will we ever know the truth? As the investigation continued, the specter of doubt loomed large. Despite modern advancements in forensic science, no breakthrough emerged to solve the case. New theories and new suspects would continue to surface, but they could never replace the one thing everyone truly sought, the truth. The case would remain open, but the chances of finding the answers were growing slimmer with each passing year. Theories and speculations have defined the narrative of Bob Crane's murder, adding layers of complexity and intrigue but no clarity. The idea of a jealous lover, an angry actor, or a financially motivated spouse has kept the case alive in the public imagination, but these theories remain just that, unverified speculations. John Henry Carpenter's defense, in particular, complicated matters by introducing the theory of a revenge-driven actor, which only further muddied the waters. As the years passed, the case remained unsolved, the questions unanswered, and the truth just out of reach. Despite technological advances and new theories, Bob Crane's murder remained one of Hollywood's most enduring mysteries. With every potential lead, the possibility of closure grew more distant. And as the years continue to pass, the mystery continues to haunt those who were closest to Crane, leaving behind a trail of unanswered questions that may never be resolved. As time passed, the case of Bob Crane's murder, despite all the advancements in forensic technology, remained an open wound. The years of speculation, theories, and false hope continued to take their toll. For Robert Crane, and for the rest of his family, the unresolved nature of the case was an emotional burden that never seemed to lift. Each year, they clung to the hope that a new development would bring them closer to the truth, but each time, the answers seemed more elusive. The murder of Bob Crane left more than just a void in Hollywood, it left a mystery that cast a long shadow over those who loved him. For Robert, the unanswered questions surrounding his father's death became as much a part of his life as the memory of his father himself. Bob Crane was not just a victim of an unsolved crime. His death became a symbol of how sometimes, even in the face of technology, time, and relentless searching, the truth can remain hidden. In the end, the legacy of Bob Crane's murder was not just about his death, it was about the emotional toll it took on those closest to him. Robert Crane, still searching for answers, would continue to carry the weight of that mystery for the rest of his life. Hollywood might have moved on, but for the Crane family, the questions would never fade. And as the years went by, the hope for closure seemed more distant, but the need for it never diminished. Bob Crane's legacy may forever be tied to the unanswered questions of his death, a legacy that continues to haunt the world of Hollywood. Thank you for your incredible support. Red Heart. This channel thrives because of viewers like you. Join our YouTube membership today to unlock exclusive perks, enjoy premium content, and help us keep creating the stories you love. Which story do you want to be covered?